Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the second edition of our exclusive client-only webinar series. Throughout this series, we'll explore how various financial crimes manifest across different industries, dissecting their nuances and impacts. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Melissa, and I'm a customer success manager at Themis. I've had the privilege of working closely with our clients to understand their challenges. I also serve as a compliance officer and MLRO with significant experience in the UAE real estate sector. Joining me today is my colleague Olivia Dakin. Olivia brings a wealth of expertise in financial crime research and thought leadership. Today, we will focus on organized crime groups. Our goal for the webinar is to spread awareness about various threats posed by OCGs, how they operate, and their impacts on society. So, Olivia, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. I am Olivia Dakin. I'm the Associate Director in the Insight team at Themis, and I lead on a variety of research projects from sort of multi-year, multi-100-page report things to smaller pieces, training, outreach pieces and activities and thought leadership, articles and webinars and podcasts and things like that. Prior to Themis, I've worked across the public and private sector in a variety of roles, including strategy and policy, ethics, finance, journalism, research, due diligence, data protection for organisations like the Natural History Museum and Kew Gardens, the NHS, Telegraph Media Group. So a variety of roles, very much a jack of all trades and a master of none. But all of those roles have really led me to my current research interests, which are particularly environmental crime and human trafficking. And it's through those prisms that I've really got interested in organised crime, because there's increasing penetration of these serious transnational organised crime gangs in those two spaces and areas. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk about organised crime today. And it will very much be through those prisms of environmental crime and human trafficking that I will be looking at organised crime and giving some sort of examples on that.
Thank you, Olivia. I know the Insight team has done quite a bit of research on this topic. Is there anything in particular that you want to point out to our audience?
Yeah, so obviously we are time limited today, so I won't be able to talk as much as I would like on everything that I would want to, but we're going to send round some links to the research that I've done on this after the webinar. So if there's anything that you're interested in, you can kind of read up in a little bit more detail. But in particularly, there's a research report that we published this year on environmental crime, particularly looking at deforestation across Asia, sort of Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Amazon, or kind of Latin America more widely, and looking at the convergence there with financial crimes. And one of the things that we found was just increasing involvement of organised crime activity underpinning all of this. So things like narco cattle ranching activities, which organised crime groups use to launder while they're deforesting the Amazon. So a lot of really interesting examples on that one. We'll also send around a briefing note about human trafficking and how that's increasingly a transnationally organised activity. And then another briefing note, which was an area that I got very interested in, specifically on organ trafficking, or what was referred to sometimes as the red market. So there'll be lots of examples in there. I'll sort of touch on all things very briefly in this webinar, but there's much more research there that you can read about afterwards if any of it particularly interests you.
Thank you, Olivia. Audience, throughout our webinar, we encourage your active participation. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat feature below, and we'll address them during our Q&A session at the end. Before we dive deeper, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the immense pain and challenges faced by victims of organized crime. Their experiences often go unseen, but they are very real and devastating. Olivia, my first question to you would be, if you could take us through the current scale of organized crime that you're seeing in the field, how big of a problem does it really seem to be?
A huge problem, in short. But I'll start off. So I wanted to I think it's quite interesting to look at these problems rather than just in looking at sort of stats and figures, which can be quite hard to conceptualize, by looking at them through the lens of their victims. So all the people on the screen are victims of organised crime in some way. We've got in the top left-hand corner, Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira, so the murdered journalist and activist who were killed in the Amazon in 2022 by organised crime gangs, particularly involved in environmental crime and also sort of illegal unregulated fishing specifically. If we move around clockwise, this could be somebody who's been the victim of an online romance scam, so somebody maybe in the UK or Australia, particularly being targeted by these cyber scamming camps, which are being run in places like Africa and Asia. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. Moving down into the bottom right-hand corner, this is somebody who's had their kidney trafficked. It might be somebody who has been in a refugee camp, for example, perhaps fleeing conflict or a climate emergency, and they've had all of their possessions sort of destroyed. They've got really no way of supporting their family. So then these organised crime gangs send these reps to these camps, and they offer to buy their organs off them, their kidneys particularly. They offer to pay them, but illegal organ trafficking is illegal in every country apart from Iran. So there's no way that these victims can ensure that they get paid if somebody then decides to take their kidney, vastly underpay them or pay them nothing at all. There's no way that they can really go to law enforcement because they're doing an illegal activity themselves. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, this is the opioid crisis in North America. So this graph, in case you're wondering what the different browns represent, this sort of reddier brown is synthetic opioid overdoses, and the muddier brown is organic. So organic is things that are derived from the poppy, like heroin and opium, and synthetic would be things like fentanyl. So that whole crisis, which I'll talk a bit more later, has been attributed to sort of organised crime gangs, particularly kind of Mexican drug cartels. So all of those victims, I just wanted to sort of show that they are very geographically distant. They are all, you wouldn't necessarily think that they had anything in common by looking at them, but they are all the victims of organised crime. And I think that really shows how far and wide transnational organised crime activity has spread, how many sort of nooks and crannies and corners of the world and our society that it really does infiltrate. And it kind of cuts across the vast majority of serious threats and issues that you might think that the world is sort of facing. So I mentioned things like refugee camps, conflict, so violent conflict and climate change, inequitable access to resources, mass migration, all of those sorts of things, organised crime. It kind of enables them or facilitates them, or it, you know, exacerbates them. It can profit from them in some ways. So it's a real kind of scourge in our society, I would say, really sort of exploiting all of these vulnerabilities already. And there's this very quite eloquent quotation that really appealed to me. I just first want to say, I don't want anyone to get distracted by the different spelling of organised with an S and a Z. I am a stickler for correct spelling and grammar. We're spelling it with an S because I'm British, and that's how we spell organised. But a lot of the organisations that work in organised crime spaces, they're international, they spell it with a Z. So don't think that this is just an absolute blunder on this slide and we can't spell. But this quotation, I think, really appealed to me. I think it really speaks of the problem of organised crime very, very poetically. It grows in the cracks of our fractured world. And I've put this picture of a tree here to really try and stretch the analogy as far as I can take it, by thinking about, you know, a little crack in the road or the pavement, and a little seed gets in. So that crack might be something like a conflict, some sort of existing problem, social problem. Organised crime weasels its way in, it takes advantage of that, it exploits that situation, but it grows and grows and grows. And before you know it, it's really pulling up, it's uprooting the pavement, it's sort of destroying that cement and concrete. It's really destroying and undermining the fabric of our society and our democracy, really. And it's a huge problem. So if we move just onto the next slide, don't get too bogged down in the numbers on this graph. Essentially what it's showing on the x-axis there, you've got sort of most of the common predicate crimes to money laundering. So these criminal markets like human trafficking and drugs trafficking, arms trafficking, environmental crime, cybercrime, other financial crimes, all those sorts of things. And what it's showing is that between 2021 and 2023, none of these criminal markets contracted. Every single one of them either expanded or it stayed the same. And if you think about the illicit economy in that time, loads of sectors and markets have contracted and decreased and suffered. That's not the case for these criminal equivalents. So it's a massive, massive threat to the economy. And actually, just taking one example, so environmental crime, which is obviously just one criminal market, the growth rate of environmental crime is 5 to 7% a year. And that's 2 to 3 times higher or faster than the growth rate of the illicit economy. So it's really outstripping that. So it poses, as well as all these other things that it affects, it poses a really grave threat to the economy. And the Global Organised Crime Index has estimated that over 80% of the world's population live in countries with high levels of criminality. So it's a massive problem that affects everyone. It doesn't just affect small localized societies around these particular cartels or gangs that are happening. It's increasingly a transnational exercise and endeavour that is really, really affecting everyone across the world.
Thank you, Livia. The impact of organized crime is profound and far-reaching. It affects not only the victims directly involved, but also communities, economies, governments. Could you shed some light on this?
Yeah, so these are just some of, there are a huge number of impacts of organised crime, but these are just some of the ones that I've put here that are particularly devastating and really operate on a global scale. And I'm going to go through some of them in more detail later on, but just to sort of run through, threats to freedom and human rights. As we saw, the killing of Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips, there are a lot of extrajudicial killings that happen in the name of organised crime, targeted assassinations, particularly of journalists who are sort of working to expose organised crime operations. So that's, that really threatens people on an individual level, but it also threatens sort of, freedom of speech as well. So death and violence, there's this sort of the national security piece. If you think about things like Ecuador, so Ecuador's current state of emergency, which has been continually extended this year, that's really brought about by organised crime, by one of the heads of the cartels in Ecuador escaping from prison earlier in the year. You've got civilians that could be caught in the crossfire between Mexican cartels, for example, that are vying for dominance. So there's a huge sort of effect that happens kind of around organised crime activities. I'll go more into detail on environmental destruction and health risks with some examples later, and economic development as well. Threats to the global financial system. So that's thinking, all of these crimes are predicate crimes to money laundering. So their profits and their proceeds, all of that is going to be eventually sort of laundered through the global financial system. So that poses a grave threat there, sort of in terms of legislation and regulation, and just to the integrity of our financial system. And then rising cybercrime. I mentioned that cyber scamming example at the start. That's obviously, I'm sure everyone is aware that there's been a real sort of sharp increase in cybercrime over the past couple of years. And a lot of that is really driven by this organised crime activity that's kind of increasingly involved in that and undertaking it on a really large scale.
Thank you, Livia. I noticed you mentioned national security. So how do organised crime groups pose a threat to national security? And are there any specific examples of how OCGs can undermine a nation's stability?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting example, actually. So to go back to that, at the start when I was talking about the victims of organised crime and the fentanyl and opioid epidemic in the US. So fentanyl is it's a synthetic opioid. It's 50 times stronger than heroin. And I'm sure you've all heard of the opioid crisis in the US. For some sort of scale, 100,000 people, it's thought at a minimum, died in 2022 from overdoses of fentanyl. And Washington has sort of increasingly accused China of this being a sort of a deliberate strategy to undermine the US as a world power. So synthetic opioids, they are created from precursor chemicals. So these are chemicals that have to be combined to create a drug. That's the difference between synthetic and kind of organic opioids. And the precursor chemicals that make fentanyl, are predominantly manufactured by Chinese chemical companies. And these are then shipped to Mexico, where Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, so that's the most sort of violent and really notorious of Mexico's cartels. They create fentanyl, they then traffic it up across the border from Mexico into the US, where obviously a lot of people get addicted, and there are these sort of awful statistics on the numbers of people that overdose there. So the US, actually, the Department of Justice a couple of months ago has charged 24 people in relation to a Chinese underground banking network that has laundered these drugs, these fentanyl proceeds, and it's sanctioned a lot of China's entities in relation to fentanyl manufacture as well. But it's really accused China of working with these Mexican cartels as part of a national strategy to sort of take America down kind of from the bottom up by sort of destroying its citizens in a way. And something that I think is really interesting about this example as well is it shows one of the increasing trends in organised crime circles is the diversification of their criminal activities. So it's no longer that there would be necessarily a drugs trafficking cartel and an arms trafficking cartel. There's a huge overlap now between them all. And in this example, Mexican cartels are apparently paying these Chinese chemical manufacturing companies in illegal wildlife, so protected species. There's a particular fish called the totoaba fish that's found in one very specific region of Mexico, and their bladders are in very high demand in China. They're used in the traditional Chinese medicine trade, and these cartel individuals are basically, buying the precursor chemicals for fentanyl with these protected species. So it shows that kind of that intersection with environmental crime that I'm really interested in, but B, that diversification into all these different criminal markets at the same time. And I think the interesting thing here as well is just to say that, it's not just American citizens that are taking fentanyl that are going to be affected by this. It really exposes the finance industry and other sort of firms around the world to the risks of these activities. So if you think about firms who are providing shipping insurance for these chemicals, or for that these fish are being trafficked on, or providing trade finance, a lot of these activities, firms aren't really aware of what it is that's being shipped on the on the ships that they're sort of insuring. So things like that, it can really expose the sort of the wider economy as well. The victims are not just the people who are taking the fentanyl themselves.
Thank you, Olivia. Given your research on human trafficking and its connection to organised crime, could you share your insights on how these groups operate in this area?
Yeah, so human trafficking is obviously a huge threat if you're thinking back to those impacts to kind of liberty and on an individual level, people's sort of health and freedom. So there's a huge trend. So over worldwide, it's thought that about 50 million people are living in conditions of modern slavery and human trafficking. So that is a huge number. And there's emerging a really strong link between that and organised crime in the way that these organised crime gangs are thinking about kind of operating. So using a sort of forced labour force, which is obviously free labour. In fact, in many ways, they can actually generate income from that. So things like debt bondage, where they are forcing their victims to pay them back for their transit across the sea, for example, for the tools that they might be using in factories, for their visas, for their sort of accommodation, which is often awful, their food, all those sorts of things. So they've got a free labour force, they're potentially generating income from that labour force. They're also able to use that labour force to scale up their activities because, there are now more of them. Also de-risk them because they're putting a buffer zone really between them and law enforcement. If you've got a victim of human trafficking undertaking illegal mining, rather than the criminal themselves, they're not on the front line for being caught anymore. And then it allows them to sort of diversify their activities. So environmental crime, as I've mentioned many times, is another area that criminals are sort of increasingly getting involved in an organised nature. You might think of things like coltan mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You may have heard of coltan. Is a mineral that's in all of our mobile phones. It's used in electric batteries, so it's an increasing demand for sort of renewable energy, like electric cars, the transition to the kind of clean energy economy as well. And a really striking statistic is that about 40%, it's estimated, of deforestation around the world is undertaken by victims of modern slavery. Another way of kind of thinking about that is that if everyone in the world who's a human trafficking victim, who's working under conditions of forced labour, if they all had the same nationality and they all belong to the same country, then that country would be the third largest emitter of carbon behind the US and China. So huge intersection there between sort of environmental impact of organised crime activities and human trafficking as well. And again, this can have, you know, a real impact on firms who are, if you're providing financing or investment, for example, in a mining operation or an industrial logging operation that has organised criminal involvement. Obviously, there's that criminal nexus that exposes you to, but also your sort of ESG, your sustainability metrics, and your carbon footprint. That's got a massive impact on that as well.
It feels like it would be remiss to talk about organized crime without mentioning the mafia. Do you perhaps have any insight on this?
Absolutely. Again, I think it's a really interesting example. It involves environmental crime. It's not the most current example, but I think it's really illustrative at the increasing penetration of organised crime groups into the environmental sector. So there was a lot of organised crime groups got attracted in Italy, so a lot of mafia groups, to the renewable energy sector, particularly the wind sector, in the early days when there were subsidies that they were obviously using to try and incentivize people to get involved in this new economy. And they sort of took advantage of these subsidies, they penetrated it. There are actually a lot of these individuals who are very high up in mafia gangs who have got these nicknames like the Wind Father and Lord of the Wind and things like that. And another area that they are really involved in is waste burning, sort of waste trafficking. So there's this area in Italy just above northeast of Naples called Campania, which has been called the Triangle of Death because it's one of Europe's largest illegal waste sites. And over 10 million tons of sort of illegal industrial waste was dumped there over the course of 2 decades. Eventually, the government declared it an environmental disaster. There was this extensive sort of cleaning up organisation. But it was really undertaken by the Camorra, which is an organised crime syndicate, a mafia group that's based in Naples, and they were undercutting the cost of legal waste disposal. They were relying on sort of corrupt officials and bribing them, threatening them to get involved in this. And the problem with illegal waste disposal, and particularly illegal waste burning, is that the health and safety measures really aren't being adhered to. So Campania became known as the land of pyres because there were all of these fires releasing all these sort of horrible toxic plumes of smoke that were taking place. And these sort of poisonous dioxins, which are really horrible things that you really don't want in your body, that were released into the atmosphere. And around the millennium, thousands and thousands of cattle in the region died. They were bearing abnormal fetuses. There were these really high levels of toxins that were found in the region's milk products. So the dairy industry collapsed there. So it's also got this really economic impact as well. And still, so the problem with, the water cycle, as I'm sure you'll know, is that it goes round and round, it's recycled. And so there are still these horrible carcinogens, so things like arsenic and lead and tetrachloride that are still in the water that is being used to irrigate the region's farmland. And they've been found more recently in vegetables from Campania. And there are reports that indicate that the region's cancer mortality is up to 80% higher than the national average. So there's a real threat to human health, to animal health, wildlife health, and the environment as well, from these activities that the mafia is involved in.
Thank you, Olivia. How about technological developments? Have you seen any notable trends in your research?
Yeah, it would seem remiss not to mention tech, wouldn't it, as a tech firm? So yeah, cybercrime is, as I mentioned at the start, absolutely an area which is increasingly being used by organised crime, and in which trafficking victims are also used. So particularly around the Mekong in Asia, there's a bit of a trend that we're seeing of really highly skilled migrants, so people who have been have university degrees, who are tertiary educated, being kind of lured by so-called recruitment agencies to work in kind of highly skilled tech positions around the Mekong, particularly Cambodia. And they get there and it turns out that they've been trafficked into these sort of online cyber scamming camps, sometimes kind of physically chained up, and on a mass scale, these organised crime gangs are basically attempting to scam individuals in the West. So as I said, sort of UK, US and Australia are particularly targeted. And the really horrible thing here again is this the sort of model that the organised crime gangs are operating is this very kind of strategic business profit-driven model, obviously, where these trafficking victims, if they refuse to work or if they get too ill to work because they're not kept in very nice conditions, they're then used as blood slaves. So this is very much what it sounds like. They have their blood forcibly taken. The thing with blood is, obviously, for those of you who give blood know, blood regenerates. It doesn't regenerate as quickly as it's taken from people in these circumstances, but they can be strapped up to something, have their blood let, and also have their organs taken from them. Corneas is a big one. All of these can be harvested for sale on the black market. There's a really, as I mentioned, the so-called red market. There's a really big market globally for organs. Sort of thinking, rising sort of waiting list times for organ transplants, and also things like diabetes and these sorts of so-called sort of like wealth diseases that basically people need more organ transplants for, are really driving that market. And so it's this model that the organised crime gangs are using, where it's like strategic, you're kind of maximizing and capitalizing on your investment in these victims. So you're using them for forced labor. It's a free labor force. They're generating income and profit for you. They're highly skilled, so they're able to undertake things you might not be able to undertake. And then when they cease to be useful in that way, you can turn them into a physical commodity. You can basically cut them up and sell them off in parts. And this sort of organized crime activity, it has a huge impact on individuals who are, sort of scammed into giving away all of their savings, all of their pensions, on companies as well. I'm sure you've all heard of those AI scams where sort of voice cloning or deep fake videos, people have been sort of induced to basically make huge payments of sort of hundreds of thousands of pounds because it seems that they've got a message from their CEO asking them to do that. There are lots of examples in the press. I actually know people who that's happened to, who are quite close to me as well. So again, a huge impact on people all over the world from that rise in cyber scamming.
Thank you, Olivia. This is so uncomfortable to listen to, but each of us need to know, and this really needs to go out there for us all to understand and spread awareness. Last question from me on a positive note. What motivates you in your work against organized crime, and what gives you hope for the future?
I think what motivates me is really the environmental and the sort of social aspect. So I think it's really important what I always try and do in my research. I think obviously white collar crime is not a victimless crime, but often people think about things like fraud or sort of companies being scammed as a sort of reasonably sort of insulated activity. But looking at these sorts of examples, I hope it really shows just how much devastation it wreaks on the environment, on humans, on animals. Those are all these things. I find animals particularly, they've done nothing to anyone, and they really don't deserve this sort of treatment. So that I find really motivating, the horrible things that people do to each other, in the name of profit. And that personal element as well, as I said, so I know people, every member of my family has fallen victim to a scam, including me. I know other people in Themis have been as well. It can happen to anyone. So I think that's what kind of really motivates me. And I think probably similarly what gives me hope is people. So, I guess people who've tuned into this webinar, who are interested in it, who want to talk about it and learn about it, maybe spread the word about it. Particularly people on the ground who are defending criminals, as I mentioned at the start, people like Bruna Pereira and Dom Phillips, these journalists who are sort of working tirelessly, particularly journalists who really sacrifice, can sacrifice their lives in a physical sense of being murdered, but also sacrifice them lives. They're living in underground bunkers in Mexico because they're reporting on organized crime gangs there, and they are basically never able to go out again because they've got a target on their heads. Those sorts of things, that sort of personal sacrifice, I think really gives me hope. I don't think it's one of those things that the fight is ever going to really be over. But I think as long as people care and are aware of it and are fighting back, it's a fight worth fighting.
Thank you, Olivia. I urge each of you in the audience to consider how you can contribute to the fight against organized crime and support those affected, whether it's spreading awareness or volunteering. Every effort counts. On that note, I'd like to open the floor for questions. Please use the chat feature below to submit any questions you may have. If we are unable to cover your question in this webinar, please reach out to us and we're more than happy to have a chat. While we are compiling your questions, I think this is the perfect moment to highlight Themis Search's unique risk mapping functionality. I used the risk map of Themis Search to create this map of associated individuals and entities linked to the Sinaloa cartel in under 10 seconds. So this visual representation provides valuable insights into the cartel's network. So we've got a question, Olivia, for you. Given the complexities of international relations, how do we effectively differentiate between organized crime and political conflicts, especially in cases where countries like the US accuse states, such as China, of enabling or collaborating with criminal organizations like drug cartels?
It's a really good question, and the answer is probably not a straightforward one. It's an increasingly grey area because lots of corrupt states, so Russia, China, Mexico, there's a lot of penetration of government and sort of public sector services by organised crime gangs. So trying to separate it out is very difficult. There's obviously a lot of hybrid, as you referred to, kind of hybrid warfare that's being waged on a level of sort of cyber warfare, as well as physical warfare, as well as these sort of horrible undermining things where states are basically collaborating with organised crime gangs. So I think that is one of the things that makes it a really difficult problem, because a lot of the people who are in positions of power who might be able to help sort of crack down on organised crime are sometimes benefiting from it and involved in it themselves. One of the ways I think is just really important to try and tackle that is by sort of private public sector kind of cross-sector collaboration. So where you've got law enforcement working with the judiciary, working with government, working with NGOs, working with the private sector, all of those different responses, you can kind of take different elements. You've got, NGOs helping the victims of crime and looking at really what's happening on the ground to feed back that information. Private sector looking at it from the point of view of kind of financing, detecting and disrupting and really robbing criminals of the sort of the finances that allow them to undertake their activities. And then all of those different bits working together is really important. The other really important thing is working internationally, because we are a massively globalized economy. All of these geopolitical things, they don't happen in a vacuum. They're affecting the whole world at the same time. So data sharing and kind of cross-collaborative efforts are really, really important there. That's something I think really interesting from my previous work on data protection, the tension there between protection of the individual in terms of data protection and actually the impacts that can have hampering efforts against sort of criminals and organised crimes in the way that countries sort of share data between them. So yeah, I don't think there's a particularly straightforward answer to that. It's a massive, massive problem, particularly because, organised crime has penetrated really all levels of society across the whole world.
Another question for you is, do you think organised crime will always be ahead of law enforcement?
Yeah, it's really sad to say yes, but possibly. I think, it's a really good point. I think often law enforcement is playing catch up because you have to sort of see a trend emerge in order to predict what a criminal is going to do. There are so many things that a criminal could do, and they're predicting it. You're going to follow one of numerous possibilities, and so most of the time criminals are one step ahead because law enforcement are having to see what's happened in order to respond to it. I think that's particularly the case when it comes to kind of new technological interventions. Having said that, there are things, so some of the work that we've done on the illegal wildlife trade, where we have published data on the sort of shipping routes and the shipping techniques that wildlife traffickers use. There was a sort of a question around that and a concern of, if you're publishing that data, is it going to give criminals a sort of a leg up? Is it going to show them what we know? And is it going to mean that they are going to stop using those routes and find different routes? And we haven't found that. We found they're still using the same routes because those are the easiest routes. They're the routes that work for a reason. So you're still sort of squeeze, and there's this thing of squeezing the balloon. You know, you squeeze one area and you force them somewhere else, and you force them to kind of adapt and use new techniques, but you're still making it difficult for them. You know, if you squeeze the balloon here, they're just having to dot about all over the place. So it's still a really worthwhile endeavor. And you know, things like AI might make it easier for there to be less of a lag, I would say, between kind of law enforcement and criminals as well. But yeah, up until now, that has, I would say, been the nature of the beast slightly.
Thanks, Olivia. I've got one interesting question. What countries are taking anti-financial crime most seriously?
That is a very good question, a very big question. It really depends on the type of crime that you're looking at, I think, particularly. So human trafficking efforts, for example, Australia's been really good there. The UK has actually been really good there. The US is sort of coming up a little bit more now. If you think of things like environmental crime, that's a really big one. You know, Brazil has actually taken a really sort of a lead there in terms of kind of regulation, because it's obviously a huge problem for Brazil with the Amazon and various other sort of big protected areas of national forests. So it's hard to answer that on a global level, because it really depends which market you're looking at. And there are also differences between the financial institutions who are sort of on the forefront and the endeavours that they're putting in place, and governments and regulation and legislation. There can be a mismatch there. There can be countries where the government maybe doesn't seem to be taking something particularly seriously, but the finance sector really is, because it knows that, you know, if it doesn't want to be sort of shut out of the sort of the global financial system, that's really important to take those things into account. So again, not a straightforward answer, quite a kind of nuanced thing, and it would depend which sector and which crime you're looking at.
Thank you, Olivia. Audience, there are a couple of questions that we won't be able to answer in this webinar just because we're conscious of time. But please do reach out to us via email. We'll be sharing our details very shortly, and we're very, very happy to have a chat. So as I conclude, I'd like to say a big thank you to Olivia. So lovely, so eloquent. Thank you for joining us today. Here's what we learned in today's session. So we covered the global impacts of organized crime, prevalence of transnational organized crime gangs, environmental crime, drug trafficking, and human trafficking. I'd also like to take the time to share a little bit about Themis. Here are the 4 eyes of our business: innovation, which is our technology piece, an end-to-end AML and KYC platform to address all of your screening, monitoring, and investigations needs. We've got intelligence, which creates bespoke enhanced due diligence and ESG risk reporting. Insight, so a lot of threat-based thought leadership, financial crime toolkits, and training. And finally, our insourcing and outsourcing piece, which is essentially where we are an extension of your in-house financial crime compliance team. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you all for taking the time out of your very busy workday to join us today. Certificates of attendance are available upon request, so please reach out to us if you need one. You'll receive a feedback form shortly. Your input is valuable to us, so please take a moment to fill it in. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in future webinars. On behalf of the entire Themis team, thank you all for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again.